There's a saying on the internet that the general trend in long-distance migration for ancient nomadic peoples was from east to west due to the strength of China's Central Plains dynasties, and the defeated nomadic tribes had no choice but to flee to Central and Western Eurasia, where they preyed on the weaker states of India, Iran, and Europe. This argument is not entirely unreasonable, but it only captures less than half of the truth. It is correct that the conflicts between nomadic peoples and sedentary peoples in East Asia were more intense than those in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The steppes of East Asia had long been the center of most major nomadic empires in history, and over the past 2,000 years, migration of nomads from east to west was indeed the general trend in nomadic migration across the Eurasian steppe. However, this narrative overlooks many other significant facts. First, the reasons for east to west migration cannot be simply summarized as being driven away by force. Most migrations to the west, large and small, which lasted for over 1,000 years, occurred gradually under relatively peaceful conditions rather than as sudden upheavals, caused by a few large-scale wars, such as the Han Dynasty defeating the Xiongnu or the Tang Dynasty defeating the Gokturks. Second, those who promote this narrative distinguish among the agricultural civilizations across Eurasia, yet tend to imagine the steppe nomads as a single, militarily organized entity. In fact, the transcontinental Eurasian steppe is a world marked by significant internal differences. In particular, the Eastern Eurasian steppe and the Western Eurasian steppe, divided by the Altai Mountains, differ significantly in both geography and culture. These differences are key to explaining why the nomads migrated to the west, and why the conflicts in East Asia were more intense. Actually, the nomadic peoples of the ancient Eastern Eurasian steppe were always under greater survival pressures than those of the Western steppe. These pressures stemmed from both the harsh natural environment and the competition for resources with the Chinese Central Plains dynasties. Under these conditions, the nomads of East Asia faced two options: migrating to the more relaxed environment of the Western Eurasian steppe, or participating in the intense resource competition and acquiring resources from the Central Plains in the south. If using the terms on the Chinese internet, these two options can be referred to as zhuem and rein. This simultaneously led to intense conflicts between the nomadic peoples and the agricultural peoples in East Asia, as well as the large-scale nomadic migrations to the west that took place over the course of more than 1,000 years. So why couldn't the nomads of East Asia simply opt out, neither competing nor fleeing, and instead choose to lie flat? Next, let us take a look at the true nature of the Great Eurasian Steppe, where all these nomadic peoples lived. The sky, so blue, the wilderness, boundless. When the grass is bent by the blowing wind, sheep and cattle come into sight. This famous folk verse, Chi Le song, sung by the Chi Le people, a northern nomadic people during the Northern Dynasties period, may well capture most modern people's imagination of the steppes. However, the lush Chi Le Chuan grassland in the poem does not represent the vast majority of the steppes. The steppe, especially the steppes of East Asia, is a world of brutality. The Great Eurasian Steppe stretches from the Great Ulaanbaatar Steppe in the east to the Great Hungarian Plain in the west, with the dashing Anling Mountains and the Carpathian Mountains as its front and backyard, and Lake Baikal and the Caspian Sea as its neighbors. This vast expanse is covered with grasslands and deserts, but the Great Steppe is not a homogeneous world. Like cultivated lands, steppes also vary in fertility from the most barren to the most fertile. However, unlike farmlands, the main factor determining the fertility of steppes is not the soil, but the amount of precipitation. Steppes are a product of arid and semi-arid climates, where temperature and precipitation directly determine the quantity and quality of vegetation. Some areas are blessed with unique natural conditions. For example, the Chi Le Chuan in the Chi Le Song, known today as the Tumo Chuan Plain, located in the Herdao region of the middle reaches of the Yellow River in northwestern China, where had long been a contested land between sedentary peoples and nomadic peoples since ancient times. Another example is the vast grassland near the Khangai Mountains in Mongolia, which, due to its abundant water and lush grass, became the seat of imperial courts for those major empires including the Xiongnu, the Gokturks, and the Mongols. However, the vast majority of the steppes lack such favorable climatic conditions. These areas either experience low or erratic rainfall, or face temperatures so high that scarcely a few drops of water remain and hardly any grass grows. Only by raising livestock that roamed from place to place could humans transform such sparse vegetation into consumable energy. For 3,000 years, people have relied on this way to survive tenaciously, known as nomadism. In addition to differences between the steppes, there are also differences between the regions. On the Great Eurasian Steppe, the largest such division lies between the Western and Eastern Eurasian Steppe. The dividing line between the Western Steppe and the Eastern Steppe is the line connecting the Altai Mountains and the Pamir Plateau. If we compare the entire steppe to a balanced scale, the Altai Mountains would be the fulcrum, with the Eastern and Western Steppe as the two pans. If this scale measures the habitability of the steppes at each end, we would clearly see that the scale is unbalanced, with the Western Steppe far outweighing the Eastern Steppe. Why is this so? The reason, again, lies in the climate. The western steppe stretches all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, unlike the eastern steppe, which is cut off by mountains far from the coast. Westerly winds carry warm, moist water vapor from the Atlantic Ocean all the way eastward. The western Eurasian steppe benefits from these maritime winds, receiving more abundant and stable precipitation. However, the farther east we go, the less of this benefit the steppe receives. The precipitation becomes less frequent, with temperatures dropping as the Siberian cold current enters. The cold slows evaporation, offsetting the shortcoming in precipitation to some extent, and making the eastern Eurasian steppe a harsh yet not uninhabitable environment. Sir Barry Cunliffe, professor of archaeology at Oxford University, coined the term steppe gradient to describe the phenomenon of the Great Steppe becoming increasingly cold and barren from west to east. The differences in resource endowments between the western and eastern steppe are directly reflected in each region's livestock carrying capacity. Since different livestock consume varying amounts of resources, the agricultural sector uses a concept called livestock unit. For example, a cow, a horse, or a camel generally represents one livestock unit, while 5 sheep also equal one livestock unit. This measure can be used to calculate the carrying capacity of the steppes. However, ancient nomadic regimes lack credible historical records, and the circumstances after the modernization of animal husbandry cannot explain the situation in ancient times. Fortunately, the statistical records collected by the Russians in the early 20th century provide us with valuable data for comparing the carrying capacity of the eastern and western Eurasian steppe before the modernization of animal husbandry. According to the Russian statistics, Mongolia in 1918 had approximately 1.15 million horses, 1.08 million cattle, 230,000 camels, and 7.19 million sheep, totaling about 3.9 million livestock units. By contrast, in Russian Central Asia at the time of the October Revolution in 1917, the non-Russian Central Asians kept 2.26 million horses and camels, 150,000 donkeys, 2.11 million cattle, and 14.32 million sheep, totaling about 7.38 million livestock units. In other words, pre-modernization Central Asia had more than 3 million livestock units than Outer Mongolia. If we must include the data from Inner Mongolia, we might use the 4.91 million livestock units in 1949. In that case, the whole of Mongolia would have 1.5 million more livestock units than Central Asia in 1917. However, the Western Eurasian steppe should also include the vast and fertile southern Russian steppes, for which we lack the data. Moreover, much of southern Russia was long ago converted to farmland and is no longer used for pasture. If this area were included as pastureland, the carrying capacity of the Western Eurasian steppe would likely far exceed the combined total of Inner and Outer Mongolia. Estimates from ecologists can also provide supporting evidence. According to a study, carbon emissions from livestock on the Western Eurasian steppe in 1900 were a full level higher than those on the Eastern steppe. Note that in this map, orange indicates a higher level than dark blue. Moreover, the differences between the Eastern and Western Eurasian steppe lie not only in their resource endowments, but also in the severity of natural disasters. Just as farmers feared floods, droughts, and locust plagues, ancient herders were also frequently struck by various disasters. Furthermore, nomadic economies were less resilient to risks than agricultural economies, leaving people and livestock more vulnerable in the face of disasters. Of all the disasters, what the nomads feared most was the white zood, a severe snow disaster. White zoods could cause large numbers of livestock to freeze to death, die of disease, go missing, or starve for lack of grass. People too could suffer from the cold and the lack of food. In ancient times, it was common for a white zood to wipe out half the population of both people and livestock, and in some cases only 1 out of 10 would survive. On the cold eastern steppe, white zoods are more frequent and more devastating. In 2023, a white zood struck Mongolia, prompting the United Nations to raise $3.5 million in humanitarian aid. Even today, despite the modernization of animal husbandry, the situation remains severe. So we can imagine how terrifying a white zood must be in ancient times, when there was no United Nations, only a dog-eat-dog world. Being born on the ancient Eastern Eurasian steppe was anything but easy, let alone having the luxury of choosing to opt out and lie flat. There were only 2 paths before the nomads: either fight to the death against that prosperous yet way too powerful empire to the south, or journey west toward the setting sun in search of a new, less brutal homeland. The history of the Eurasian steppe is rich and complex, with countless regimes and tribes emerging one after another. Yet, to put it extremely simply, there were only 2 dynasties in the history of the steppes. One was the Indo-European dynasty, and the other was the Turkic-Mongolic dynasty. Before 1000 BC, domesticated horses were primarily used for pulling carts. Limited by human mobility, there were only pastoral, or rather semi-sedentary societies on the Eurasian steppe at that time. Between 1000 and 700 BC, humans developed fully trained riding horses. Combined with saddles and iron tools, long-distance, large-scale grazing finally became possible, and nomadic societies officially emerged. During the first millennium of the nomadic era, most inhabitants of the Great Eurasian Steppe were Indo-European-speaking nomadic peoples, leaving traces of their activities from the Balkan Peninsula to the Ordos Plateau. Their distant linguistic relatives, the Greeks, called them the Scythians, while their close linguistic relatives, the Iranians, called them the Sakas. Here I must emphasize a basic fact. Ethnicity and language are not inherently linked. The spread of languages is not necessarily the result of the population growth of ethnic groups. Just as there are tens of millions of people of African descent in the Americas today who speak the European languages, the Indo-European-speaking inhabitants of the ancient Eurasian steppe were not necessarily the so-called white people or Aryans. Archaeological evidence suggests that many nomads at the time were of mixed descent. In fact, the Eurasian steppe's always been this way from ancient times to the present. While the Indo-European dynasty ruled the heartland of Asia, the eastern end of the Eurasian steppe was inhabited by numerous peoples who spoke the Turkic-Mongolic languages, which some linguists also refer to as the Altaic languages. These Turkic-Mongolic-speaking inhabitants were called Hu, Di, Shenyun, Shunyu, and other names by the inhabitants of the Central Plains of China. During China's Spring and Autumn period and Warring States period, they frequently engaged in warfare with the Central Plains states. And in this process, the Central Plains states established the Chinese identity of ancient China to distinguish themselves from these surrounding barbaric tribes. As the competition for resources intensified, the Chinese Huaxia states occupied the mixed agricultural and pastoral areas and built the Great Wall. For the nomads, living life on the eastern Eurasian steppe was already on hard mode, not to mention facing such powerful opponents as the Chinese states, which only made things worse. At first, the nomads could roam in the areas of present-day northern Shaanxi province and central Hebei province. But following the expansions of the states of Yan, Zhao, and Qin, these areas were taken over by the sedentary peoples. The Chinese states also pushed the climatic limits of sedentary agriculture to the north, establishing the resource blockade lines known as the Great Wall in present-day Inner Mongolia and central Liaoning province. Based on this, American scholar of nomadic history Nicolas D. Cosmo argued that the Great Wall was a form of offensive weapon, compressing the nomadic people's access to resources to its very limits. In order to survive, the inhabitants of the eastern Eurasian steppe were forced to join the involution game of insane competition in East Asia. After the state of Qin unified China and established the first empire in Chinese history in the Central Plains, the Qin Han Empire, the nomadic peoples also responded by forming the first nomadic empire in the history of the steppes, the Xiongnu. Whether through trade or plunder, only by uniting could they compete with and confront the powerful Central Plains Empire. Therefore, the first nomadic empire on the steppes did not emerge on the relatively fertile western steppe, nor did they speak the Indo-European languages. Instead, it emerged on the eastern steppe, where the environment was relatively more brutal and was led by the Turkic-Mongolic-speaking peoples. As for the nomadic peoples on the western steppe renowned for their ferocity, whether the Massagetæ or the Sarmatians, their polities fell far short of the Xiongnu in both scale and organization. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the confrontation with the Han dynasty ended with the Xiongnu's defeat. But the failure of the regime didn't mean the failure of the nomads. The southern Xiongnu who submitted to the Han dynasty were granted the right to graze within and beyond the Great Wall, effectively achieving the goal of the competition. The defeated northern Xiongnu were forced to migrate to the west, subsequently disappearing from historical records. But they blazed a new trail for the nomads of East Asia, fleeing rather than competing. As mentioned earlier, the first millennium in nomadic history was the era of the Indo-European speaking peoples. Following that, the second millennium, from the 1st to the 10th century, was the era during which the Turkic-Mongolic languages gradually replaced the Indo-European languages. In the year 999, the Turkic-speaking Karakhanid dynasty of Central Asia destroyed the Iranian-speaking Samanid dynasty, a historical event that marked the completion of the transition of dynasties on the Eurasian steppe. At the dawn of the new millennium, from the Khazars and the Pechenegs in the far west, to the Oghuz and the Bulgars in the center, and to the Uyghurs and the Khitans in the far east, the Turkic-Mongolic-speaking tribes were already all over the Eurasian steppe. Historians refer to the process by which the Turkic languages replaced the Indo-European languages as the dominant tongues of the western Eurasian steppe as Turkification. In fact, the concept of the Turkic languages created by the Europeans has no direct connection with the Turkic Empire established by the Gökturks in history. This is a bit complicated. We'll explain it in more detail in future videos. Anyway, the Turkification had begun long before the establishment of the Turkic Empire. Since the northern Xiongnu after the collapse of the Xiongnu Confederation, over the course of several centuries, numerous groups of inhabitants of the eastern steppe who spoke the Turkic-Mongolic languages embarked on migrations to the west. Through a series of conquests and peaceful exchanges, the linguistic landscape of the western Eurasian steppe gradually shifted, transforming from a world of Indo-European languages to one dominated by Turkic languages. While the trend of fleeing was in full swing, Participating in the involution game of intense competition still remained a viable choice for the nomadic peoples of East Asia. In the 4th century, following the collapse of the Chinese unified Western Jin Empire, the peoples on the northern steppes poured into the great turmoil of the central plains of China. Amid this chaotic era of the 16 kingdoms of the 5 Hu, the Tuoba Xianbei, led by the Tuoba clan, a nomadic people from the steppes of northern China after the Xiongnu, emerged victorious and established the first long-standing dynasty founded by a northern people that unified northern China, the Northern Wei dynasty of the northern dynasties. However, these victors of the competition would not sympathize with their fellow nomads who were still struggling. The Northern Wei dynasty, claiming to be the legitimate successor to the former Chinese Huaxia dynasties of Chinese civilization, built up defensive lines along the Great Wall, and continued guarding against and suppressing the steppe peoples such as the Rouran. From the northern dynasties through the Sui, Tang, Liao, and Jin dynasties, regardless of which dynasty held power in the Central Plains, the game of involution in East Asia had never ended. Of course, those who fled successfully to the Central and Western Eurasian steppe would also not show mercy to their nomadic brethren who came after. In the 11th century, the Hungarians converted to Catholicism and established themselves in Eastern Europe as the shield of Christianity, preventing Western Europe from ever again facing another nomadic invasion. During the same period, the Seljuk Turks took over Baghdad, swept through the Eastern Roman Empire, and wielded the caliph's authority over the other Islamic states. Yet the Seljuks also built up defensive lines in Khorasan of Iran to prevent the entry of other nomads who came after. As for the Rajputs of northwestern India, they were even among the most ardent devotees of Hinduism. Descended from nomadic peoples themselves, they had been the backbone of India's resistance to nomadic invasions for the past 1,000 years. However, there was no Great Wall in the western half of Eurasia after all. Its resources were still relatively more abundant, and the mountainous regions in West Asia and South Asia ultimately could not hold off the nomads for long, especially after the collapse of the Seljuk Empire in the 12th century. The whole of Iran completely lost its ability to block the migration of nomadic peoples. For over 1,000 years, "Go West" remained one of the most compelling slogans for the nomads of the eastern steppe. In the mid-18th century, Wu Bashi Khan, leader of the Torguts who lived along the banks of the Volga River, received shocking news. The Dzungar Khanate was destroyed by the Qing dynasty. A century earlier, to avoid competing with their Oirat Mongol brethren for resources, to escape the game of involution, the Torguts migrated all the way to the west and found a new home in Europe. However, with the rise of Tsarist Russia, life in Europe became increasingly difficult for the Torguts. Upon hearing the news of the Dzungars' defeat, Wu Bashi Khan had the idea of reverse fleeing from west to east and carried it out. On their return journey to the east, the Torguts encountered a white Zud and were relentlessly pursued and blocked by the Cossacks and the Kazakhs. By the time they returned to the eastern steppe, they were utterly exhausted and had suffered heavy losses. They also found out that the Qing dynasty had already established firm control over the frontier, so the Torguts chose to submit to the Qianlong emperor and accept resettlement. In fact, the Torguts made a wise choice. Under the rule of the Qing dynasty, the struggle for survival on the eastern steppe was no longer as fierce as it had once been. Once upon a time, Genghis Khan proposed the crazy idea of turning all of northern China into pastureland, hoping to permanently resolve the nomadic people's anxiety over resources that had lasted for over 1,000 years. In the early years of the Ming dynasty, the Hongwu emperor and his son the Yongle emperor launched successive campaigns to the north and built massive fortified cities, escalating the competition on the eastern Eurasian steppe to its climax. However, with the mid-Ming dynasty's policies of abandoning frontier territories and contracting borders, vast lands in the Hetao, Saibei, and Liaobei regions fell under the control of the nomads. Coupled with the success of the Lung-Qing peace agreement, the Mongols' anxiety over resources was actually significantly eased. After the Qing dynasty became the new rulers of the Chinese Central Plains, they also established a new order in the Mongolian plateau. The Qing dynasty ruled the Mongols through the 3 pillars: the League Banner System, Tibetan Buddhism, and royal intermarriage, combined with a series of policies that could be described as vicious, including deterrence, rewards, disaster relief, and population control, which maintained an unprecedented peace and stability in the steppe region. The life of ordinary herders remained extremely difficult, but the era of either competing to the death or fleeing for survival had passed. The eastern Eurasian steppe, along with all of East Asia, was about to brace itself for the challenges of great changes unseen in a millennium. As for the western Eurasian steppe after the 15th century, long-distance migration remained the norm for the nomads. The mountainous regions of Iran and Afghanistan were filled with migrating nomadic tribes. The three Iranian dynasties of the 18th and 19th centuries were all founded by nomadic peoples. The Afghan Shahs and the Mughal emperors also welcomed the nomads, using them as cannon fodder in their conquests of India. The rulers of the Ottoman Empire originated from Central Asia, yet they despised nomadic tribes and routinely exiled the nomads who migrated to the west to Cyprus. Nevertheless, after the Kazan, Nogai, Crimea, and other khanates were annexed by Russia, the Ottoman Empire still accepted large numbers of refugees. The age of the large-scale migrations of nomadic peoples finally came to an end in the 20th century. Modern nation-states including China and the Soviet Union completed the demarcation of the borders, and modern governments including the Republic of Turkey and the Pahlavi dynasty of Iran granted the nomads citizenship. Pastoralism began adopting modern production methods as modern animal husbandry, and many herders' children began living in cities. For ordinary people, the conflicts between nomadic peoples and agricultural peoples, as well as the large-scale migrations, have become distant history. If someone asked me, what contributions have the nomadic peoples made to world civilization, I would answer like this. My friend, do you know how yaks live? On the bare mountains, yaks lick moss and lichen off rocks with their tongues, surviving tenaciously on such thin energy. Some of us humans live in a way similar to yaks. They invented ways to harness limited energy, leaving human footprints in the most remote and barren places. My friend, we have been educated in materialism and understand that material conditions are primary. Look at the harsh environment of the steppe, the limited population, and the pitifully small material surplus. What right do we have to demand that nomadic peoples build magnificent palaces or discover complex formulas and theorems? The greatest contribution of the nomads is simply to live bravely, live like eagles, live like ants, live like you and me. My friend, I know that the conflict between sedentary agricultural peoples and nomadic peoples is so ancient, older than all of the religious holy wars and ideological cold wars. But I beg you, instead of those imagined grand narratives and abstract concepts, focus more on the people and individual persons. The nomads of history were just like you and me, who could not choose their background or environment. Faced with the pressures of survival, they longed for freedom and an ordinary life but could not attain either. Whether to fight or to retreat was never theirs to decide. The emperor's golden palace, the khan's white felt, the dragon wall made of stone lying on the frontier, the fully drawn bow, the spilled milk, and the red of wind-dried blood on withered grass. This is the world of nomads. This is the world of everyone. We believe that the greatest meaning of life is life itself. Thank you for watching.